The Keth called it the acquisition. This was their word for it, in the formal records of the Keth Dominion that survived into the era when those records became evidence. The acquisition of the third planet, Sol System. Standard year 2187. A 22-page administrative document describing the logistics of integrating a newly discovered sapient species into the Dominion's labor classification system. 22 pages. The document noted that the species, designated Subject Category H, was bipedal, moderately intelligent by Keth assessment metrics, physically unremarkable relative to the Dominion's other labor species, and possessed of a complex linguistic system that the document described as sophisticated relative to expected cognitive level but insufficiently advanced for integration into Dominion administrative communication. The document recommended labor classification at Category 3, which was the classification for species the Keth assessed as capable of following complex instructions but not of contributing to technical or administrative functions. The document was approved at the Dominion's administrative level in what the Keth calendar marked as 7-12 on Earth. The date was March 14, 2187. What happened on that date and in the years that followed is not recorded in the Keth administrative documents, because administrative documents do not record what happens to the people being administered. It is recorded in other places. My name is Yael. I am going to tell you what happened, which I can do because I was given the specific and terrible gift of living through the end of it, and because the people who lived through the beginning of it gave me everything they remembered so that someone would be able to tell the whole story. My grandmother was born in 2197, 10 years after the acquisition. She was born into a labor installation in what had been the city of Lagos, Nigeria, which by 2197 was not a city in any sense that the word city had previously meant. It was a work zone. 40,000 humans assigned to mineral processing operations that the Keth Dominion required for the expansion of its industrial infrastructure in this sector. My grandmother's name was Amara. She told me this herself when I was young, and she was very old and still one of the sharpest people I had ever met. She told me many things. The thing she told me first, always, before anything else, was this: we kept track. The Keth had made several calculations about the humans they had acquired, and most of those calculations were accurate in the narrow sense of being correct about the variables they included. They had calculated that humans could perform the required labor. This was correct. They had calculated that humans, assessed at Category 3 cognitive level, lacked the strategic capacity for organized resistance. This was a calculation that would prove to be the most expensive error in the Dominion's 400-year history. The error was not in the assessment of human intelligence in isolation. The error was in what the Keth assessment metrics were designed to measure. The Keth measured individual cognitive capacity. They were good at this. Their assessment tools were sophisticated and had been developed over 2 centuries of integrating labor species, and were reliably accurate for the species they had been calibrated on. They had not been calibrated on a species whose most fundamental survival technology was not individual cognition but collective memory. Humans had been telling each other what happened for a very long time before the Keth arrived. They had been passing information across generations through language, through story, through the specific and ancient human practice of ensuring that what the living knew did not die with them. The Keth had not destroyed this capacity because they did not know it was dangerous. They had not destroyed it because it did not register in their assessment metrics as a threat. Individual humans, assessed individually, did not read as strategically capable. What the individual human could not do, the collective human memory could. What my grandmother knew, she told my mother. What my mother knew, she told me. What the humans in every work zone across 300 years knew, they told each other, quietly, in the spaces the Keth surveillance did not reach. In the languages, the Keth translation systems had not fully mapped. In the codes and stories, and songs that humans had been using to carry information across danger since before any of these stars had been named. My grandmother told me, we kept track of everything. The names of everyone who died and how they died. The names of the overseers who gave the orders. The serial numbers of the Keth administrative systems that processed the labor quotas. The dates, the locations. The specific instructions that led to specific deaths. All of it, she said. They thought we couldn't understand their records. She paused. We understood them. We couldn't read them at first, but we learned. She said, they thought we were Category 3. She paused. We let them think that. The first generation learned the Keth language in secret. This is the thing that the Keth administrative records do not contain and that the human historical record preserves in extraordinary detail, because the humans who did it understood what they were doing and understood that the record needed to survive. It was not easy. The Keth language was complex, and its written form was more complex still, and the humans who learned it had no formal instruction, no dictionary, no teaching materials beyond what they could observe and deduce, and share with each other in the margins of their working hours. They learned it because they had no other choice. Because the administrative documents that determined labor quotas and resource allocations and the specific decisions that controlled every element of their lives were in Keth script. Because understanding those documents was the difference between knowing what was coming and being surprised by it. Because knowing what was coming was the difference between surviving and not. The first generation spent 30 years building a functional literacy in Keth administrative script. They passed what they learned through careful networks, person to person, in the labor installation communities that the Keth had organized for logistics efficiency, and that, without the Keth understanding it, had also organized the humans for communication. My grandmother's grandmother was one of the first generation of readers. Her name was Kofi. She was a mineral processing technician who worked 16-hour shifts and who spent the remaining 8 hours of each day teaching the 40 people in her installation what she had learned about Keth script that week. She died at 61, which was old for that generation. What she had learned did not die with her. The second generation could read, not fluently, not in the full technical and formal register of Keth administrative language, but with sufficient competence to extract the operational information from the documents that the Keth administrators passed through the labor installations without. Apparently, considering the possibility that the Category 3 laborers might be reading them. What the second generation found in those documents, they recorded. This is where the record becomes something that I can only describe with the specific reverence it deserves. The humans in 300 years of Keth labor installations, with no access to electronic recording systems. Number writing materials that the Keth surveillance would not detect. No institutional infrastructure of any kind maintained a comprehensive historical archive. They maintained it in human memory, organized across human networks. Passed from person to person and generation to generation with the specific discipline of a people who understood that the record was everything. The disciplines varied by community and by generation. In some installations, specific individuals were designated as memory keepers, whose primary responsibility alongside their labor work was to hold and transmit specific portions of the archive. In others, the archive was distributed, with every member holding their portion and the collective assembling the full picture. In all of them, the verification practice was the same. Information was confirmed by multiple independent sources before it entered the archive. A death was not recorded until 3 people who had witnessed it confirmed the details. An administrative decision was not recorded until the document had been read by at least 2 readers, and their readings compared. 300 years of this produced an archive that was, when it finally became evidence, more comprehensive and more accurate than the Keth's own administrative records. The Keth administrative records had gaps where documents had been lost, or where events had not been recorded because the recording system had malfunctioned or because the administrator had not considered the event worth noting. The human archive had no gaps. The humans had considered everything worth noting. My grandmother was born in the 3rd generation of readers and the 10th generation of memory keepers. By the time she was born, the network had expanded from the original labor installations to a system that covered every major human population center in the Dominion's holdings, which by 2197 included not just Earth, but 3 extraction sites on Luna, 2 on Mars, and for asteroid installations in the outer system. The network communicated in a layered system that had evolved over generations from the original informal information sharing of the 1st generation. The outer layer was the operational communication, information relevant to survival in the current period, labor quota changes, administrative personnel rotations, upcoming inspections, resource allocation shifts. This was information that could save lives in the short term and that was shared broadly and quickly. The middle layer was the strategic intelligence, information relevant to the medium term, Keth administrative planning cycles, resource priorities, the political dynamics of the Dominion's relationship with its other labor species, the technological and military infrastructure that maintained control. The inner layer was the archive. 300 years of documented history, preserved with the disciplined accuracy of people who understood that this record was the proof. Not proof of their suffering, which they did not need to prove to themselves. Proof for the future. For the tribunal that they believed, with the specific faith of people who have nothing but their belief in the future, would eventually convene. My grandmother told me, we always knew it would end. She paused. Not because we were certain someone would rescue us. We knew it would end because things end. And when it ended, we needed to be ready. She said the ready part was the record. The Keth made their second significant error in 2401. The error was administrative. A labor restructuring program designed to improve processing efficiency required reallocating human labor populations across installation sites, which required moving humans who had been in specific communities for generations to new locations. The Keth calculated this as a logistical problem. It was. They solved it efficiently. What they did not calculate was what it did to the network. Moving humans from communities they had been in for generations did not disrupt the network, it expanded it. Humans who had been in isolated installations for years were suddenly in contact with humans from other installations. Information that had been contained in one community's archive was suddenly shared with 10 other communities. The network, which had been growing slowly through careful extension, exploded. By 2410, the network had full connectivity for the first time in its history. By 2415, the inner layer of the archive, the 300-year historical record, had been shared across the full network for the first time. The people in every human community in the Dominion's holdings now had access to the complete 300-year record. They knew everything. Not just what had happened in their own installation. What had happened everywhere. Every decision, every death, every administrative action, every name of every person who had been lost, and the documented circumstances of each loss. My grandmother told me what it was like to hear the full archive for the first time. She said it was the most devastating thing I have ever experienced. She paused, and the most clarifying. She said, you knew things had been bad. You lived in bad conditions. You knew people who had died of those conditions. But you understood it as your experience and your community's experience. She paused. When you heard the full archive, you understood it as 300 years of a systematic practice applied to every human being everywhere. She paused. She said, after that, there was only one question. What question? She said, what do we do with this? The answer took 15 years to develop, not because the humans were slow, because the answer had to be right. Because 300 years of surviving had taught them that the difference between an action that worked and an action that didn't was rarely strength or willingness. It was preparation. They had been preparing for this moment for 300 years, without knowing when it would come. Now, they knew the shape of what they had been preparing for. The network organized itself for the task, with the specific competence of a system that had been doing difficult work in impossible conditions for generations and had built, through that experience, a capacity for coordination that the Keth had never measured because the Keth assessment tools were not designed to measure what 300 years of necessity had built. They had the archive, they had the language, they had the network. They had 300 years of documented evidence, verified by multiple independent sources, organized and cross-referenced, and ready to be presented to any tribunal that existed or could be created. They had one more thing. They had been watching the concordance. The concordance of free species was not the body it would later become in 2430 when the crisis came. It was a loose coalition of autonomous species in the galactic region, organized primarily for trade and mutual defense and information sharing, and characterized by the specific limitations of a body whose members had very different interests and histories and levels of institutional development. The concordance was not a perfect institution. It was not even a particularly powerful one by Keth Dominion standards. But it had something the Keth Dominion did not. It had a legal framework. The Concordance's legal framework had been developing for 200 years, and it included, among other things, a body of law on sapient rights that the Dominion had signed in 2280 as a diplomatic formality, and that the Dominion had understood correctly as having no enforcement mechanism. What the Dominion had not understood was that the framework existed, that the signatures existed, that the obligations existed, documented and verified and available to be presented. The humans had been watching the Concordance develop this framework. They had been watching because the network's middle strategic intelligence layer had been tracking Dominion diplomatic activity for 150 years, and the Concordance legal development had been visible in the diplomatic records that the network read. They had been watching, and they had been thinking about what the framework would mean when it was presented not as a theoretical claim by a powerless party, but as a documented case backed by 300 years of verified evidence. In 2430, the Concordance's legal framework reached a point where its enforcement mechanism, which had been developing quietly as the coalition grew stronger and more organized, was sufficient to matter. In 2430, a delegation of 47 humans appeared before the Concordance's Council of Species. They were Category 3 laborers by Keth classification. They were permitted to travel to the council chambers because a Keth administrator had approved a transit document without reading it carefully, which was an error that the network had been specifically positioning to create for 8 years. They stood before the Council of Species, and they presented the archive. The presentation lasted 11 days. Not because the humans were slow, because the archive was 300 years long. The 47 human delegates, not soldiers, not politicians, not trained lawyers, because humans had not been permitted to become any of those things, presented the documentation with the systematic precision of people who had been preparing for this moment for their entire lives and for whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had been preparing for it for their entire lives. They presented the dates, the locations, the names. They presented the Keth administrative documents, which they had been copying for 150 years. And they presented the human archive alongside them, and they showed, item by item, how the human record and the Keth record corresponded and diverged, and what the divergences revealed. They presented the legal argument, which had been built over 40 years by humans who had taught themselves the Concordance's legal framework, from the diplomatic documents that the network had been monitoring, and which was precise and complete, and which addressed every procedural objection that the Keth legal representatives attempted to raise. They presented the Keth Dominion's own signatures on the sapient rights framework, dated 2280. They presented 300 years of evidence that those signatures had been worth nothing. On the fourth day, the Keth delegation attempted to challenge the archive's provenance. They argued that an unverified oral tradition maintained by a category, 3 labor species, could not be treated as reliable historical documentation. The lead human delegate, a woman named Dr. Amara Vasquez, who had taught herself law from Concordance legal documents and who was my grandmother's granddaughter, stood at the presentation stand and said the following. She said, "The archive was maintained with verification protocols that exceed standard historical documentation practice. Every entry was confirmed by multiple independent witnesses. Every document transcription was verified by multiple readers. The internal consistency of 300 years of archive documentation, cross-referenced against the Keth's own administrative records, demonstrates a reliability standard that this council can assess independently." She paused. She said, "We would also note that the Keth classification of humans as category 3, insufficiently intelligent for reliable historical documentation, is one of the claims that the archive directly suggests that this council not accept the Keth's assessment of our cognitive capacity as a basis for dismissing our documentation of what the Keth did to us." The council chamber was quiet. Then the chair of the council said, "Please continue." She continued. The deliberation lasted 41 days. The outcome was not certain. The Concordance's legal framework was real, but the enforcement mechanism was tested. And the Keth Dominion was a significant power, and significant powers in legal proceedings have resources that influence outcomes. What the Keth Dominion did not have, and could not create, was a counter-archive. They had 22 pages from 2187, and a fragmented administrative record full of the gaps that well-organized bureaucracies accumulate when they do not believe their actions require documentation. The humans had 300 years of verified evidence. The Concordance's council deliberated for 41 days and issued its judgment on the 42nd. The judgment was 37 pages. Its operative conclusion was that the Keth Dominion had violated the sapient rights framework to which it was a signatory, that the practice of labor acquisition and retention of sapient species required immediate cessation, and that reparative measures were required as a matter of law. The enforcement mechanism that the Keth had assessed as insufficient turned out to be sufficient, not because the Concordance had become a military superpower in the years the humans had been watching, because 38 other species in the Concordance had been watching the proceedings for 41 days, and several of them had their own histories with the Keth Dominion that the human archive had illuminated, in ways that had not been illuminated before, and their collective willingness to enforce the judgment was a different calculation than the Keth had made. The Keth Dominion signed the cessation agreement. Humanity was legally free at 0900 on a day in 2-for-30. That we mark on our calendar with a specific name in every language we have maintained, and several we created specifically for this purpose. The liberation process took for more years. I was born in 2432. I was born into the process. Into the specific period when being legally free and being actually free were two different things that were becoming, year by year, the same thing. My grandmother was alive when I was born. She was alive until I was 17, which meant I had 17 years with one of the people who had spent her entire life building toward this. I asked her, when I was old enough to understand the question, "Were you afraid it wouldn't work?" She said, "Yes." I said, "What did you do with the fear?" She said, "Kept working." She paused. The fear was real. The work was also real. "You do the work." I said, "What if the council had decided differently?" She said, "Then we would have gone back and we would have kept the archive and we would have looked for the next opportunity." She paused. "The archive would still exist." She paused. "That's the thing they never understood about us." "What thing?" She said, "They thought what we were doing was waiting for rescue." She paused. "We weren't waiting. We were building." She paused. "The archive wasn't a record of suffering kept in hope that someone would pity us. It was a legal case being prepared for a tribunal we believed would eventually exist." She paused. "We built the tribunal's case for 300 years. Then we brought it to the tribunal." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "They classified us as Category 3. She paused. "They thought that meant we couldn't understand what they were doing." She paused. "We understood everything they were doing. We documented it. We prepared. We waited for the moment." She paused. "Category 3. She said it one more time, in a way that contained 300 years. "Category 3. She looked at me. She said, "You know what 300 years of being told you're incapable of understanding teaches you?" I said, "What?" She said, "It teaches you exactly how much they need you to believe that. The concordance today is different from the concordance of 2430. It is larger, stronger, more institutionally developed. The legal framework that the humans used is not the framework that exists now. It has been revised and expanded and strengthened by the 41 days of proceedings and the 40 years of legal development that followed. Development that the human legal scholars who had been building their case for 300 years contributed to substantially once they were permitted to participate. I work for the Concordance's Legal Archive Division, which is the institution that maintains the historical records that international legal proceedings require. I work there because my grandmother told me about the archive. Because I grew up understanding what an archive is for. Because the practice of keeping careful records of what happens, for the future, for the tribunal that does not yet exist but will, is the practice that saved my species. My colleagues in the Legal Archive Division are from 14 species. They know the human archive story. It is, in the professional literature of legal historical documentation, one of the most studied cases in the field. The human archive is considered the founding document of the Concordance's current approach to historical evidence standards. My colleagues sometimes ask me what it was like to grow up in a family that had been part of the archive's maintenance. I tell them what my grandmother told me. She said, "We kept track." I tell them, everything else follows from that. I have a daughter. Her name is Amara, which is my grandmother's name and her grandmother's name and the name that has passed through our family like the archive itself. Carried forward because it should not be lost. She is 6 years old. She already knows what an archive is for. She already knows that you keep track. She already knows the names. She asked me once, sitting in the way that children sit when they are asking something important, "Mama, why did they think we would forget?" I thought about this question for a long time. I said, "They thought we were Category 3. She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means they didn't understand what we were." She thought about this. She said, "What are we?" I looked at her, and I thought about my grandmother and her grandmother and 3 100 years of people in labor installations, who kept careful records in the dark because they believed that the future would need them. I said, "We are the species that remembers." She said, "Is that important?" I said, "It's the most important thing." She thought about it. She said, "I'll remember too." I said, "I know you will." She said, "What should I remember first?" I said, "The names." She said, "Whose names?" I said, "Everyone's."